Let's go ahead and talk about how to read a pattern. I know you may not be able to see this pattern very clearly, but I'm going to go over all the different parts that you'll typically see in a pattern. First of all, at the top we have the name, and we have the indicator of the skill level, and some will say beginner, intermediate, advanced. Some will just say easy, medium, or hard. This pattern does say that it's easy. It gives us the finished size. So if you see a pattern you like for a blanket and you want to make sure it's going to be large enough, you can always look at the finished size. It will have a list of materials. You do not always have to go exactly by the brand of yarn specified, but the pattern does say worsted weight yarn, so you should make sure that what you're using is worsted weight yarn. If you're going to stray from the type of yarn that it says to use, when you want to make sure you have enough, you can go by the yards. It says that this yarn is 170 yards per ball, and there's 5 balls. So when you go get yarn, you need to figure out 5 times 170. Make sure that's how much yarn you buy. On the label of the yarn, it will have the yards, and it will also have the grams. You can't always go by the weight in grams because different sizes of yarn will weigh differently, but the yards will always be the same. So no matter what kind of yarn you get, you can tell how many yards to buy by reading the pattern and checking the label. You should go by the yards for sure. You need to use the hook size specified, or your pattern's not going to come out right. Your size will be off from what's given. Some of the hooks don't look too different, but they'll still yield a different size, so make sure you follow the pattern when it tells you what type of yarn and what size hook to use. Each pattern will give you a gauge. This gauge says 14 stitches and 8 rows equals 4 inches. So say the stitch throughout in this pattern, let's say it's a double crochet. This is telling you that once you have 14 double crochets this way and you have 8 rows going up, that should measure out to be 4 inches. So you can always, before you start the pattern, whatever stitch is used throughout, let's say double crochet, you could just go on and double crochet, well, chain 14, double crochet 14 across, do 8 rows, and then measure it. If you are larger than 4 inches, then you're crocheting more loosely. If you're smaller than 4 inches, you're crocheting too tightly. And then once you start your pattern, you can try to adjust that. If you have made that square that you gauged, if it was too big, then you know throughout the pattern you should try to crochet more tightly. Whereas if your square was smaller, then you know when you're working the pattern you can try to crochet more loosely. This pattern has a stitch explanation because it's for a shell stitch blanket. I'm going to show you some shell stitches later on, but when a pattern does require something different from just a plain old single crochet or double crochet, then sometimes it'll tell you a stitch explanation. This stitch explanation says that 5 double crochet shell is a 5 double crochet and indicated stitch. So once you come across the place in the pattern where it says to make a 5 double crochet shell, that means you're going to work 5 double crochets in that indicated stitch. So not all patterns will have a stitch explanation, only when it has a new type of stitch like a shell or a V-stitch or something different. It'll have an explanation to tell you what it means, because throughout this pattern what they're going to say is to make a 5 double crochet shell instead of saying work 5 double crochets in that stitch. And with that explanation, you know that when you see 5 double crochet shell, that means you're going to work 5 double crochet in that stitch. This pattern also explains the color sequence. You can always variate from the pattern when it comes to the color. You do not have to follow the colors given. You can work whatever colors you like. But if you want your pattern to look just like the picture, then the color sequence guide will help you to figure out when you're changing colors and things like that. Okay, then the pattern actually starts. First of all, it tells you with A, chain 80. Because there's 5 different yarns, they're labeled A, B, C, D, and E. And even if you're using different yarns, you can just figure out which one will be your A, your B, your C, so that you're able to follow the pattern without getting confused. So basically with your first color, the color that you want to start with, just chain 80. Then it goes into row 1. This says RS, that means right side. The side facing you will be considered the right side. Once you get to the end of that row and you turn, that will be considered the wrong side. And once you turn it again, you'll be back on the right side. Because this is a blanket, each side is actually going to look exactly the same. They're not going to be very different at all. I've never noticed a difference. Unless it's some kind of reversible blanket, then it really doesn't matter which side's the wrong side and which side's the right side. Then it begins the instructions, and it tells you to single crochet in second chain from hook and in each chain across. And then at the end it says 79 stitches. You chained 80 and then you worked 1 single crochet in the second chain from the hook and all the way across. So at the end you're going to have 79 stitches. A lot of blankets will have an odd number or a strange number of stitches because of the pattern. This is a shell stitch, so it does require a certain number of chains or a certain number of stitches to complete a shell. Typically it takes 5 stitches to make one shell. There is a such thing called a starting chain formula, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But that's why there's an odd number here, because of the way you're going to make your shells. And throughout this pattern you actually have some half shells at the ends, and that's why there's that odd number of stitches. Now the pattern will tell you the first several rows and how to complete them, and then it just tells you rows 5 through 60. You're going to repeat row 4. So it'll get you started, and then it's going to tell you to just repeat what you've been doing, or it'll tell you to repeat a specific row, or it'll say for row 5 repeat row 2, for row 6 repeat row 3, and continue that way throughout. Just make sure you read your pattern. Even before you get started, you should go ahead and read it. Make sure you understand all the terminology used, that you'll be able to do those steps. You'll be able to look up anything you don't know before you get started. You do not want to get halfway through a blanket. You don't even want to get a few rows into a blanket and then realize you're not going to be able to finish it. It's very disappointing. So go on and read your patterns before you get started. At the end of this pattern it tells us how to finish. There's an edging going around this blanket, and there's usually an edging around most blankets. So this says from right side, join B with a slip stitch in any corner. Again, with a blanket it really does not matter which side is the right side. It's pretty hard when you keep turning it back and forth to keep up with what side's the right side. When you join your yarn in any color, in the corner, it really doesn't matter which way the blanket's facing. As long as you'll be able to work from right to left, that's all that matters. And then once you're done, if there's a side that you prefer, you can keep that side facing up, but you probably won't be able to tell a difference at all. So then it tells us round 1 and round 2. If you notice, before it said it went by rows, and now it's going by rounds. And that's because we're starting in one corner and we're working all the way around. Instead of working flat and going side to side and turning it over every time, we're starting in a corner and we're working all the way around the blanket to make that border. At the end, it tells us to weave in the ends. I'm going to show you how to do that shortly. But there is one more thing I want to show you. You probably cannot see it too well. I think it's a little blurry. But the pattern gets us started here. It says with B, chain 1, turn, single crochet, and first single crochet. Then we have an asterisk. The asterisk says skip next 2 single crochet, 5 double crochet, and next single crochet. That's your shell. Skip next 2 single crochets, single crochet, and next single crochet. And then we have another asterisk. Whatever's inside that asterisk will be repeated. So don't mind what I just read to you. That's just an explanation. Most patterns will have an asterisk, and then it'll have directions, and then it'll have another asterisk, and it'll tell you to repeat that throughout. So when you see asterisks, you know what's inside the asterisks is something that will be repeated throughout the row, and you'll just repeat that to the end, or if it's, say, a hat, you'll repeat that till you get back to the beginning of the round. And most patterns at the end will tell you what you should have. In this case, it tells us 13 shells. So instead of counting every single stitch that we have, you could just count your shells. You want to make sure you have 13 shells, and that means you didn't add or drop any stitches, you didn't miss anything, you didn't mess up. If you have too many or too few, then you might want to study your blanket, see if you can figure out where you messed up. If you can't figure it out, just tear out that row and work it again. If you check that at the end of every row, then that'll keep you from getting too far and then realizing that you messed up. So the most important thing is before you start out, you want to make sure you're reading the pattern. Make sure you understand everything the pattern is going to tell you to do, and make sure you get the proper supplies. You want to make sure you have the right weight yarn and the correct size hook. Now I'm going to explain the starting chain formula to you. Sometimes you'll find a specific stitch that you like. This stitch here is called butterfly lace. You see it kind of looks like a butterfly. But from this point to this point does require a certain number of stitches to be able to make that design. Now the beginning of this stitch explanation says chain a multiple of 15 plus 4. The multiple of 15 is so that you can have that many butterflies. That tells me that this butterfly lace takes 15 stitches to complete. So I need to chain a multiple of 15 plus 4. That plus 4 is probably going to be the turning chain or something like that. So if I wanted to make a blanket that repeats this butterfly stitch all the way from the beginning of the blanket to the end of the blanket, then I can just chain a multiple of 15, and then when I've reached my desired length, as long as it's a multiple of 15, I can go on and start the stitches to complete this design. If you're making something small, like just maybe a toy blanket for a baby to hold on to, stick their fingers through the lace, then you could just chain, say, 45 or 60 and go on, and this pattern takes 6 rows, so then you could do 6 rows, 12 rows, 18 rows until you've reached the length that you like, and then you would be done. But if you want to make a large Afghan, a huge blanket out of this, then you need to make sure you chain a multiple of 15. It's going to be really wide, and then plus those 4 extra ones, and then you'd be able to follow the pattern to complete the design. And then you would just repeat. See, there's 6 rows here. You would just repeat rows 1 through 6 to keep making this pattern over and over again. So that's your starting chain formula. If you come across a stitch or a design that tells you chain a multiple of X number plus another number, +2, +3, something like that. That's your starting chain formula, and that's how many stitches is required to complete the design. Occasionally a pattern will tell you to chain loosely, and that's pretty subjective. It's something you're going to have to judge. Just maybe hold your hook looser, hold your yarn looser, and try to make those chains as loose as you can. Sometimes you're going to go back and once you're finished, work back through those chains for another part of the pattern. There's usually a reason why they want you to chain loosely. This is a little looser than I normally would chain. Subconsciously, when I'm chaining, I just go fast, and it's probably loose as it is. But if I see a pattern that tells me to chain loosely, then I try to go a little bit slower, hold everything looser, really take my time, and consciously try to make sure they're looser than they normally would be. And another thing about patterns is that oftentimes patterns will have errors, even patterns that are published in books. You might come across something that doesn't make sense, or it's not working out right. You've torn your work out 5 times, you're still getting the same thing. Sometimes it is an error in the way the pattern's written. If you look at the websites for yarn companies like Lion Brand or Red Heart, and you get patterns from there, a lot of them allow comments at the bottom, and you can read through those before you start the pattern. Sometimes people will have already found errors and they'll post what they discovered. Usually those companies will go back in and they'll change the pattern so that it's correct, but it's still a good idea when you do find patterns online to read the comments, read what other people say. They'll also tell you if they thought the pattern was hard, if they thought it was easy, if it took too long, if it worked up really quickly, if they were satisfied with it, if the pattern was difficult to follow. So it is always helpful to look at those patterns online on the yarn company websites and read what others said about it, especially when you're starting out. It'll be a good indication of whether or not you'll have an easy time working the pattern, or if there's a lot of mistakes, or if it's just too difficult.